Let's have a look at question 4. So it is about writers' views and methods. But as we've just seen from the exam paper, it's the writer's views that they're more than prioritizing on the paper, because it's actually the name of the paper itself. So this is a typical question 4. You need to refer to the whole of source A and the whole of source B. And you need to compare how the writers have conveyed their different views and experiences of the festival and fair they describe. So the 2 pieces of writing this time round, one of them was about Glastonbury Festival and the other one was about a summer fair in Dickens's time, in Dickensian England, Victorian time. So you had 2 pieces of writing, one about a modern day festival, a pop and rock festival, and the other one about a country fair. Compare how the writers have conveyed their different views and experiences of the festival and the fair they describe. You get 3 bullet points for this question, and it's always the same. They say you must compare their different views and experiences. So you must compare the views of the writer of source A with the views of the writer of source B. And you must compare the methods that they use to convey those views and experiences. So methods in this case means how have they used their skills, have they used their techniques in order to put across those different views and experiences. And as always, on section A on both papers, if you make a point, you must support that point with references to the texts. So you must have quotes, or at the very least line numbers, for both texts in your answer. So excuse me, I'm going to unshare and let somebody in, and then share again. Hello. There we go.
Hello.
Hello, you're in. Good. So this is a question 4. They're always pretty much alike, but you do need to understand exactly what you're doing on the questions. So question 4 is worth 16 marks, and you should spend around 20 minutes on it. Now, 20 minutes is a long chunk of the time in order to get up to 16 marks, and but you really shouldn't be allowing that time to go over. So if it is a matter that you're spending half an hour or more on question 4, you probably aren't going to get more marks simply because you're spending more time on it. So do watch your time on these questions. You are comparing writers' ideas and perspectives. Interesting that AO3, that's Area of Learning 3 on the GCSE, talks about writers' ideas and perspectives. It does not talk about methods, even though this question does talk about methods. Again, I think that shows the priorities. So question 4 is all about the writers themselves. It's much more about the writers than it is about what they've written about. It's not about the people or the things they're writing about. It's about them and their views and their ideas. It's also, question 4, about the methods that the writers have used to put across those ideas. So there are 2 separate things you have to keep side by side as you go through your answer. What are the writers' views and what methods have they used? What the question is not, well, this is not a language analysis question. Although you're using quotes and you're talking about methods, you might be quoting things like metaphors and similes. You are not asked to analyze them or explain them. So it is not a language analysis question. The language analysis question is question 3. You do not have to do that on this question. It is simply asks you to compare the different views in the text. So you're looking at the different views of the writers, and you're also looking at the methods that they use to show their attitudes or points of view. You're not being asked to explain the quotes. You simply say what the quote is, what it does. That is, you name it. It is a simile, it is a metaphor, and then you quote it. You don't have to explain it. So the question format. Compare how the writers convey their different perspectives on ... Okay. Another slight pause whilst we let somebody else in.
Hello.
Hello, Nasia. We've just started. Okay.
Okay.
Hopefully you can.
Then.
No. Hopefully you can see the PowerPoint. We're looking at the format of paper 2, question 4.
Okay.
So compare how the writers convey their perspective, their different perspectives on ... Now, whatever comes after the ... that's really important. That's because it won't be about anything and everything in the piece of writing. It will be about one particular aspect of the piece of writing. Now, it will be an important one. Yeah. Yeah. If you've got noise in the background, can you switch off your mic, please? Thank you. It won't be a minor one. It will be probably the most obvious theme, but be careful that you don't get, that you don't just go off and start writing about what you presume the differences are. And they might have ideas and perspectives and points of view and all sorts of different things. You're only looking for the different perspectives on a particular aspect of the text. So make sure you read that bit at the end. Seems obvious, but lots of people don't do that. And then they answer the wrong question. You're being asked to do these different things by the bullet points. It says compare the different attitudes. So you need to know, you need to identify what are the writer's attitudes? What do they think and feel about the subject that you're asked to compare? You need to compare the methods they use to show these attitudes. So how does the writer present the attitudes? That is, as they're writing about them, what sort of language features or structural features do they use? And you need to back up your ideas with quotes from the text. That's your evidence to show that you've taken your answers from the text, not from anywhere else. Not from, you haven't just made it up. It's there in the text. So it does submit itself to a bit of a format. You can actually format your answers to make it easier. You know exactly what you've got to do at different places in the answer. The word convey means to show, or to put across. So when it says convey, it means methods of showing. How does it convey the ideas of the authors? What methods does it use to show the ideas? So methods is much more familiar to us than convey. Methods means the writer's techniques, how they've done it. You need to give examples of language and or structure features used to show the ideas or attitudes of the two writers. We are familiar with talking about language features, and a little bit we're familiar with talking about structure features. Those things that we talk about in question 2 and 3 on paper 1 and 2, the language question, and on paper 3 on the paper 1, the structure question. You can on this paper, you can reuse the examples you had in the language question on question 3. So if in question 3 you talked about, you identified a metaphor. You talked about onomatopoeia. You had some sort of hyperbole or something. You identified some language features about source A. Well, you can use those examples again in question 4. There's absolutely no reason why you have to find new ones. As long as they're relevant to the answer and they are talking about the subject, which is whatever the writer's ideas and methods, feelings are. Any questions so far on this? I often think it feels more. Farsia, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I thought there is no method or no language used in question 4, but here you say you need to give example of language and structure techniques.
Yeah, this is question 4 on paper 2, and you are writing about how, well, first of all, what the writer's point of view is, and then how the writer has shown that point of view. And of course, the main way that they show their point of view is through the use of language. You don't have to comment on the use of language. You don't have to analyze it, but you will have to identify it. So if you say that the writer has used a metaphor in order to show how angry they are about the state of prisons today in Britain. Yeah. So how do they get this idea of their anger across? That's their point of view, anger. How do they get that point of view across? They use a metaphor. That's a method. Yeah. But it's a language, technique, isn't it? But all you have to do is then quote the metaphor. You don't have to explain it.
I understand. Thank you.
Okay. So you'll need to give examples of language or structure features from both of the writers, or to flesh out your answer. So perspectives. Now, the words that you actually get in the question will change. It'll say, how does the writer convey his or her or their points of view? It could be perspectives, it could be attitudes, it could be any of these ones in red here. They all more or less mean the same thing, if you think about it. Point of view, position, attitude, frame of mind, approach, vantage point, ways of looking, interpretation. Basically, it's what do the writers think? What is their main thought or feeling about what they're writing? And as long as you understand that, don't worry too much about which word they've used this time. Sometimes they might give you two. They might talk about the writer's beliefs and experiences about the subject. And what you'll find maybe is that one of the two is more about what they've gone through in relation to the subject, rather than sitting back and taking a kind of an academic view of it. But nevertheless, it is almost always the same type of thing. You're looking at what they think and believe and feel about whatever the subject is, no matter how they've actually worded it. So question 4 is about then reading the question. What subject is being referred to? So when it says, how do the writers convey their points of view on whatever it is? And that is the subject that you'll want to focus on in your answer. You need to identify the different perspectives of the writers on this subject. Now, the word different here is controversial. As far as I remember, it's always been different perspectives. There is no reason why they might not say similar perspectives. So do read the question to see what they're actually saying. But I think it will be different perspectives. Different perspectives means that although they're both talking about the same subject, they take different views on them. And they will have been chosen, these two pieces of writing, because they do have different views. So if it was about fox hunting, for example, you're likely to get one person who's defending fox hunting, maybe as a countryside tradition, and the other one will be saying it should be continue to be banned because it's a horrible blood sport that is cruel. And those are two very different points of view on the subject of fox hunting. So they're both about the same subject, but they're coming at it from very different perspectives. So you need in your own mind to separate the two and know what the differences are. And then you need to identify 3 methods used to convey each writer's view or point of view. The reason I say 3 is because ideally you want to do 3 paragraphs on this answer. The AQA magic number is 3. They like points of view. They like 3 paragraphs on questions 2, 3, and 4. Now, honestly, you can probably get almost all the marks for writing 2, as long as they're 2 really good paragraphs. 3 is making sure that you've covered everything you need to cover. So don't panic if you only get round to writing 2, but try and write more than 1. And for each of them, you're going to need different methods. Now, this is right, I'll come back to this, but the methods between them don't have to be completely different, because if source A uses a metaphor to show how much they hate fox hunting, and source B uses a metaphor to show how much they like it, that's still different perspectives. The fact they've used the same method doesn't matter. You need to state these differences, ideally in 3 double P paragraphs. Now, are you all sure what I mean by double P? Double P?
The point, evidence, explanation.
Yeah, or in this case, I would say point, explanation, evidence. Yeah, it's either way. Either way. So basically, you make a point, you explain it, and then you give evidence for it. And the evidence will be a quote or a line number, where the piece of the method that you've chosen is going to be. So you say that the writer in source A is angry about fox hunting. He uses a metaphor which shows how angry he is, and then the evidence will be the quote which contains the metaphor. And that would be 1/2 of your double P paragraph. Because then you're going to say, but on the other hand, or in contrast, or just but, or however, and then you're going to do the same for source B, because you are making comparisons. So this is what I mean, really, and it gives you a format of an answer. This is just one paragraph, but in skeleton form. So I say that the writer of source A has perspective. Now, whatever I put in here is going to be the writer's point of view. So I'm going to say the writer of source A is negative about fox hunting, is fearful about using nuclear power, is angry about the strike. Whatever it is, that's where I'm going to put the perspective. You know, so you don't have to say the writer of source A. You know, if you know the name, you can say, you know, Johnson or whatever it is. But if you're going to say this, make sure you've clearly labeled which writer you're talking about. You can do it either way around, but if you're going to talk about the writer of source A, you know, just say writer source A. The reason for that is you don't want to get confused between the two writers. So you can't just use the word writer. Don't just say source A does this and source B does that. Why not? Why not say source A is upset and angry about it, but source B is happy and relaxed. Why not say that? Why not use source A and source B?
Because I do think it's changed their point of view from the start to the end. That's why.
Yeah, it might, and we will be coming to that. You're absolutely right. The point of view of a writer may not be the same all the way through the piece of writing. And if it isn't, you need to say it. But we're only talking about in one paragraph. In one paragraph, you're right, it's not the whole source. But the real reason is you're not talking about source A, you're talking about the writer's point of view. It's the writer, not the actual text that you're talking about. So I would say make sure you either use the writer's last name or you say the writer source A. Yeah. And make sure you label it. You want the examiner to know that you are talking about the writers, not the texts. That's one of the biggest differences between question 2 and question 4. Those two questions that compare. In question 2, you're talking about the text. In question 4, you're talking about the writers. So you could say that the writer of source A is whatever you think they are about the subject. And then he or she uses a named method to show this perspective. And the named method could be anything. It could be the tone of voice. It could be a language feature like a simile or a metaphor or a comparison or whatever. Or it could be a structure feature like exclamation marks or short and long sentences. To be honest, it's much more likely to be a language feature. And then you give an example of that as a quote from the text. Just an example, you don't have to explain it. That's your first half, and then you say in contrast, on the other hand, or however, and then you do the same for source B. Now, source B, the writer of source B's attitude or perspective will be different from source A, must be different. Otherwise, it's not a comparison. And then you can say they use a method, which is named. That method can be the same method because obviously it's a different text, it's a different writer, and it's a different point of view. The methods don't have to be different. The perspectives or ideas do have to be different. So you could actually compare source A's writer using a metaphor against source B's writer using a metaphor, as long as what they're showing is a completely different perspective, a completely different point of view. Okay. And don't forget your quote. So that would actually give you a plan for each of the 3 paragraphs. So here's a question as a sample. Don't know, it's got a bit mangled. I'm sorry about that. So compare how the writers have conveyed their different views and experiences of the institutions they describe. Now, obviously, we're not going to look at the actual texts, but here you had 2 writers, one of which was talking about a prison, and the other one was talking about a youth offenders institution. So basically 2 prisons, but one of them for young kids rather than adults. And you are being asked to compare the way that they have conveyed their different views and experiences of those institutions, the prison and the youth offenders institution. So we're going to you want to compare the different views and experiences. You need to compare the methods they use to convey those views and experiences. And you're going to support your ideas with quotations from the texts. So this is a long paragraph that was written in reference to that question. So And this is quite a nice way of writing it because it has a direct comparison right there in the paragraph. In source A, the writer focuses on the sound of the prism and how this changes over the course of the text. The use of the simile, humming like a hive, makes us see the prisoners as a swarm of insects working busily. Also, the verb humming suggests rhythmic sound, which almost matches the rhythm of their labours. This implies that Mayhew sees this place as functional and purposeful. It is almost as if he recognised the positives of imprisonment. Similarly, Cavendish draws our attention of keys being turned in the locks and metal gates that clang shut. The onomatopoeia clang is jarring, harsh sound, which suggests that Cavendish's experiences of prison are uncomfortable and perhaps even threatening. Now, I'd like you to have a look at that, read through, and see if you can identify where the student has talked about methods. See if you can find the methods that the student talks about for the writers of source A and source B. And if you find a method, pop it into the chat.
Sorry, Graham, my chat's not working again for some reason.
Who's that speaking? Sorry, Paula.
It's Paula, yeah.
Okay. Have you found one?
Yeah.
Go on, tell us then.
Simile.
So there's a simile. Yeah, it makes reference to a simile. Fahima, you've talked about language technique, but you have to name the language technique. You can't just say they've used the language technique.
I just simile and onomatopoeia, these two techniques used.
Yeah, so you've gone for onomatopoeia. Leela's also talked about onomatopoeia.
And
we've got
simile.
And we got simile. Yeah. Okay, good. It's not difficult, is it? It's not difficult. So they give examples. Let's just make sure that that's right. Yeah. Also, they talk about just using the verb. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Somebody got chucked out there. So I think we got some television noise. If somebody could switch off their mic, thank you. Oh, okay. More people coming in. Okay. Carl, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I can't really see the screen. You know, when it's onomatopoeia, I wanted to see what's it. I want to see the where we're referring to.
Okay.
Because I can't see it fully on my screen.
Well, you can't see the text.
I can see the text, but because we've got all the list of the phone and people, hand raised, mic, and everything, it's gone over. So I've got the onomatopoeia, then it's clang, but then I can't see any more than that.
Right. Sorry about that. I didn't. Is there no way of making the screen full screen for yourself? Anyway,
I'm not very good with these, to be honest with you guys.
It says, I'll read it. It says the onomatopoeia clang is jarring, harsh sound, which suggests that Cavendish's experiences of prison are uncomfortable and perhaps even threatening. So the onomatopoeia clang is a jarring, harsh sound, which suggests that Cavendish's experiences of prison are an uncomfortable and perhaps even threatening. So the first example is the use of simile, humming like a hive. So that's quite clearly is a simile because it uses like. And then they go on to say, makes us see the prisoners as a swarm of insects working busily. So this is a mixture of talking about the view of the writer and at the same time incorporating a method that the writer has used. But just talking about the verb is also a method, because sometimes just using a particular word, and you can refer to that as word choice or lexis if you want to be fancy, or just saying they use this word or the verb or the noun. And just choosing to use the word humming suggests rhythmic sound which almost matches the rhythm of their labors. You know, the way the workers are working, and you can maybe imagine them from that sound. It's in a piece of imaginative description, and it's their point. It's just the students' ideas, but that sort of thing is what we're looking for in explaining the methods that you think that the writer has used. Yeah. And then in the second part of the paragraph, it's now talking about the different writer. So it talks about either the writer in source A or uses his name, Mayhew. In the second one, it's Cavendish. Cavendish draws our attention to keys being turned in locks and metal gates that clang shut. All of those, the clang shut is onomatopoeia. And that is being linked then to ideas that the writer has about prison life. So going back then, which bits are to do with the what can you find? What are the prevailing ideas or points of view on prison as identified by the learner for each of the two writers? What have the two writers found for points of view of the writer on prison?
Are you talking about the bit it's focusing on the sound of the prison?
So this time I want to find the perspective of the two writers on the prisons that they were in. So can you find the bits of this text which are about what do they believe, what do they think about prisons? Where are the writer's opinions? Facia?
I think the first one, it says it's purposeful and it's positive of imprisonment, so it's positive.
Yes,
And
that's
the
it.
other one is scary, it's unfair.
Okay, that's right. So taking the first one, this thing about humming like a hive, which sounds like lots of busyness, but it's purposeful busyness, it's rhythmic, it's maybe useful. So the actual, let me get through to it. You see in blue, it says, Mayhew sees this place as functional and purposeful. Functional means it works. It has a purpose. So prison isn't a waste of these people the prisoners time isn't being wasted, it's being put to good use, it's giving them purpose, it's making them feel like they've got a function. And he recognizes the positives of imprisonment. Almost. It's almost as if he recognizes the positives of imprisonment. So despite being a prisoner, he can still see the point of imprisonment, that it has got positive factors. So if you were just simply going to write about Mayhew's point of view on prisons, you could say, that he sees it in an almost positive light, that there are useful parts of prison. It does have a function. It is purposeful. That is compared with Cavendish's point of view, because at the end, if you can't see it, it says the clanging and the banging, which is very jarring, suggests that Cavendish's experiences of prison are uncomfortable and even threatening. Now, there's a big difference between something being positive and functional and purposeful and being uncomfortable and even threatening. That's very negative. So there's quite a positive point of view from Mayhew and quite a negative point of view from Cavendish. And the way that those 2 points of view are put across is actually very clearly given to you by the student by first of all talking about method. So this is just one way of doing it. They've actually chosen to talk about method first and then move through method to telling you what they think the point of view of the writer is. So first of all, with Mayhew, the humming like a hive, which is the simile, is used to give us this idea of a swarm of insects. And humming away, matching the rhythm of their work, and that then implies that he sees the place as functional and purposeful. Because maybe to Mayhew, a group of men or women working together as if they're insects in a hive is a positive thing. It might not be to somebody else, but we are talking about Mayhew's point of view, not our point of view, Mayhew's. So we can say that he or she sees it, no, he sees it as a positive. And then the sounds of the prison are also used, keys in the locks, clanging shut, but this time it's used for a negative effect. It's jarring and harsh, and that shows how uncomfortable and threatening prison is in Cavendish's point of view. And I quite like that way of doing it because, and it's different from the one I suggested, but it's nice because it really does link the method being talked about to the point of view being shown. They're still stated separately, but one seems to suggest the other. And you are moving from the method, in this case, to the point of view. But normally, I think most people do it the other way around. They talk about the point of view, and then they say, and here's the method that is used in this case as an example. We're going to look at another little example now.
Excuse me, Graham.
Yes.
Before that, I have got a question.
Yes, please.
My question is, for example, if we have this text in the exam, for the answer, we do not need to analyze the onomatopoeia or simile. We only need to find out and write the quotes as a reference.
Yes, that's exactly right. You're saying basically the writer, to show the writer's point of view that they think prison is threatening and uncomfortable, they use onomatopoeia to show that, and the example was clang, the locks clanging. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
In its simplest, you're simply putting a quote which is the simile or is the onomatopoeia, and to show that you found it's actually there in the text. It's evidence. You do not have to explain what onomatopoeia is. You don't have to explain what this quote means.
All right, yeah, thank you.
Okay, which I think is good news, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very good.
I mean, you've got enough to do on this question. To find the methods that they use and to identify their points of view. Those are the things you have to do, and I think that's enough for one question. It already feels like two questions joined together. So let's have a look at another question. This one from a real exam paper. For this question, you need to look at the whole of source A and the whole of source B. Compare how the writers have conveyed their different views and experiences of the festival and fair they describe. So that's the one we looked at right at the beginning as an example. So this was Glastonbury Fair, and a lady who went to Glastonbury Fair, and she was sent there, a journalist, she's sent there, hated the idea of it. You know, she thought, ugh, you know, I just don't want to go, it's going to be horrible. And then she gets there and she's a bit grumpy about it. And then by the end of the story that she's written, she started to like it and she started to think it's not bad. On the other hand, Charles Dickens went to a country fair back in the 1850s or something, had a jolly day, loved everything about it, and described it vividly. So those are your two texts. Quite complex because you do have a change of point of view as it goes along, and the examiners are quite fond of doing that to you. So they'll give you one of the texts where the point of view slightly changes and you're supposed to notice. So again, we're going to compare the different views and experiences of the two writers. In this case, what do they think and feel about the festival on one hand and the fair on the other hand? And then we're going to find methods that they've used to show how they feel or think about those festival and fair. Now, in this case, I'm going to show you a text which is actually from the mark scheme that the examiners get. Now, what you're seeing is the portion of the mark scheme for level 3, which would give you between 9 and 12 marks. Now, they use levels, and then you get levels on your certificate. These levels have nothing to do with those levels. The examiner's levels go from 0 to 4. So level 4 is the highest you can get in any of the questions, but it's more the marks we're looking at. This one is a good standard middle mark range for question 4. Question 4 is out of 16, so to get between 9 and 12 is a good solid mark on this question. Obviously, we'd like to be higher and we wouldn't want to be lower, but a lot of people will sit in this area. If you're looking for a pass, this is the area you need to be in. Getting around about 10 on this one, on question 4. Now, the bit I want you to look at really, I mean, it gives indications and it tells the examiners that if they're doing everything in this list, then they need to be at the top of level 3. And if they're only doing one of them, then they need to be down the bottom. That's how they make the difference between 9 and 12. And the bits in between, it's all about judgment. And the examiners do training to get themselves to, you know, so they imagine that they're actually marking the same. Obviously, no two people ever marks the same entirely, but they tried to eliminate as much spread as possible. The bit I really like is this end column, because here what they do is they give the examiners an indicative piece of text. This is the sort of thing that that a student who's doing a 9 to 12 mark type answer will write. And what the examiner can do is say, I've looked at this and I think that the answer I've got in front of me is better than this. Well, if it's better than this, maybe it's level 4. If it's not quite as good, maybe it's about a 9 or a 10 rather than a 13, rather than a 12. If it's a lot worse than this, then maybe it should actually be in level 2. You know, it gives them the confidence to say, yeah, they're doing some of the things, but not all of them. So I'm going to put them down on maybe 10 and so on. So this one was about the two. So Elizabeth Day went to Glastonbury and Dickens went to the fair. So let's have a look at what the way it's written. From Elizabeth Day's perspective, the idea of going to Glastonbury was one of undiluted horror. And her use of words like horror, devastation, and terrible natural disaster to describe the scene reinforced this initial view. However, this changes as she realizes that the experience is not as bad as she feared, and language choices vary accordingly to describing Glastonbury as almost civilized and, at the end, almost nice. Dickens, on the other hand, is positive, enthusiastic, and joyful about the fair all the way through. Although he describes ladies screaming, complete chaos, and a dangerous crowd swinging you to and fro, the tone is always one of joy and celebration and actually positive. Now, this writing isn't a complete answer, but it is indicating to the examiner the standard at level 3. So looking at that, where again, do the same thing again. Where is the methods? Can you identify the methods that are being used by the two writers that have been mentioned?
Undiluted horror.
Undiluted horror is a quote. Is it a method?
Tone?
Sorry, go on.
Tone? Sorry, is it the method is one type of tone? Like first one is the positive way to express, like this is the things.
Okay, so where's that? The one right at the end. Oh, nice little bit of guitar music. So the tone, you're absolutely right. Right at the bottom, in the Dickens one, it says the tone is one of joy and celebration and actual positive. Yeah, tone of voice, the tone of the way it's written. You know, which is a bit like the tone of your voice, whether you're feeling happy or very unhappy. You know, you can have a very negative tone, or you can have a very positive and happy tone. And the tone of Dickens's piece of writing is very happy and enthusiastic and up. And that is a method. That is a named method, tone. Leela?
Use of words for the first one,
Yes.
which she doesn't like it at the first, and she is but at the end she almost civil. She used almost civilized and almost nice. She changed.
She changed the yes. So it was about choice of words, wasn't it?
Yes.
So she's called it at the beginning use of words. Now the thing is with these identifying methods, just like in the language question, you may use the terminology words like tone or onomatopoeia or metaphor. You can use those technical terms if you want to, or you can put them into your own words as long as the examiner understands what you're talking about. So there are technical. So is somebody speaking? Oh, I think I'm hearing me. That's very strange. Okay, sorry. You could put it onto your own words as long as it's still clear. When it comes to technical terms, the examiners don't particularly I mean, they're there on the mark scheme, but they don't want you to just sort of search for technical terms and try and use as many as possible. They actually want to see that you understand these concepts. And so they're much happier with you putting things into your own words sometimes than just throwing a label down and then they're not sure whether you really understand it. So I would try and use 1 or 2 technical terms in your exam, somewhere in the exam, but don't overuse them. So here, use of words is just as good as saying their lexis or their field of vocabulary or whatever the more fancy ways of saying it are. Yes, she's using words which are negative and indicate a slightly awful kind of outlook: horror, devastation, terrible natural disaster. These are terrible things. Equally, you could have said that this is exaggeration. There's clearly, going to Glastonbury, I've never done it myself, but I'm sure it's not really horror. It's probably, that would be an over the top way of referencing it. So there's lots of different methods that you could use here. She's just talked about use of words. Fine. And then later on, language choices vary. So it's the choice of language this time that they're talking about. It's the same as use of words, language choice. The writer chooses to use positive words or chooses to use negative words. And the fact that the language choice has varied, that is her talking technically about the methods. Yeah.
Ramin, is it
Yes.
okay to, like, for this type of answer, we use the structure the last class you explained, yeah? Like a flashcard, beginning, these things. Like first one, if I choose the structure, and second one, if I choose the language technique in my own way, is it okay to write, or we have to choose both language technique for?
No, you only need to talk about one method for each per paragraph. And the method can be something like a simile or a metaphor. It can be just the choice of words. It can be the tone of voice. It might be, for example, humor. The writer uses humor or sarcastic humor to show how much they hate the idea of going to Glastonbury. It isn't really a terrible natural disaster, Glastonbury Festival. So actually that's exaggeration. So using exaggeration to show how much she's not looking forward to it. And if you wanted to use a technical term for exaggeration, that would be hyperbole. Yes. So you don't necessarily need to find a language feature and a structure feature. I mean, you might not find any structure features at all, to be fair.
So is it okay to write like first one is language technique I found, and second one, if I didn't find any language technique, then is it okay to compare with different tone or different technique?
But those are language techniques. I mean, the tone of the narrator's voice will be down to how they've used the words. So those are all language techniques. You would call them what you think they are. So, or describe them in your own words. So if you think it's using a happy tone in order to give the impression that everything's well with the world, then just say that. But you might be then comparing that to the other writer who's actually used some very formal metaphors, and that's another type of language feature. But as I said, they might also use things like that we normally wouldn't talk about on the language question, such as humor, using humor. Because obviously, if you make the reader laugh, then you're either making them laugh with you or laugh against the thing that you're talking about. So you can use humor to attack, or you can use humor to make people feel happy about the subject. So humor is one. There are so many different ways that a writer might try and get you to understand their point of view. Okay, so here we had a change. We had the tone of voice, and we had the use of words or word choice and language choices. Okay, so, and the fact that the language choices changed. They varied towards the end. And I think that's really important here, because if you miss that out, you might end up losing marks, because the examiners will go, well, we gave you one in which you started out hating it and ended up liking it, and you didn't mention it. So there was the methods, and there was and this is where they've put their own ideas, their feelings. So Elizabeth Day's point of view was, it was horrible. At the beginning, she just thinks Glastonbury is horrible. They've used a quote to say what she meant, undiluted horror, that's fine. But then later on realizes the experience is not as bad as feared. And then later on, still almost nice. So actually she changes her point of view on the subject of Glastonbury Festival as she goes along. Whereas Dickens's point of view remains fairly solid. He's positive, enthusiastic, and joyful. Now, this is not meant to be an answer. It's just the examples of the way you might write. You're going to try and write 3 paragraphs, and therefore you might talk about Dickens's positive point of view, and then you might say, and he's very enthusiastic about some of the things which are in the fair, and then you might say he's joyful about the whole experience. And that's paragraph 1, 2, and 3 sorted for the writer's perspective. And obviously with Elizabeth Day, you've already got 1, 2, 3, because your first paragraph is undiluted horror, the second one is not so bad, and then the final one is almost nice. So you're trying to split their points of view across your 3 paragraphs. Because you're trying to fit it to a format. Now, if you look in your textbook, you are given at least 1, I think maybe 2 different methods for doing this. And we've already seen a method where it's basically you talk about source A, all of source A, with your 3 different examples, and then you talk about all of source B and all of your different examples. Or my version, which is to talk about an example from source A and then an example from source B in each of the 3 paragraphs. I think the benefit of this one is it forces you to contrast them. It forces you to show that you are making a contrast as you go along. So the writer of source A is enthusiastic about going to the fair. Yeah. He shows this by using lots of joyful word choices. Give an example of a word choice that is joyful. On the other hand, the writer of source B is very negative about the experience of going to the festival. She uses sarcastic humor, and then you give an example of a quote which is sarcastic humor. And then you go on to the next paragraph. This gives you a structure to follow. So I'm going to stop sharing that one. Any more questions so far? That was us just looking at a potted kind of trail through question 4. And now I'm going to go on to having a look at the differences and the way you can make the differences between question 4 and question 2. So people do get confused between question 2 and question 4. And I think the reason for that stems from the nature of the paper 2. Paper 1 has 1 piece of writing to read, and all the questions on section A are about that 1 piece of writing. Now, the examiners, the government, whoever, decided that one of the key skills that they want to test you on in your GCSE is the ability to take 2 pieces of writing and compare and contrast them to look at the differences and similarities and to explain those differences and similarities. So we end up with a paper 2 that has 2 texts and 2 questions which compare those texts. And because we have 2 questions that compare, people have a tendency to think that they are similar because they compare. But as I'm saying here, just because 2 things look alike doesn't necessarily mean that they are alike. So obviously you have Queen Mary of England versus Dennis Waterman, the actor who is in Utrix and Minder. Clearly they're very similar, but naturally quite different. So why the confusion? So this is a question 2. You look at source A and you look at source B, and then the question says, write a summary of the differences between these 2 men. You know, one of them was about Andrew and one of them was about Edgar. And you're simply asked, what are the differences between the 2 of them? That is a factual question. And you need to find 3 good differences between Andrew and Edgar. It's not asking you what the writers think or what the writers feel, and it's not asking you to talk about methods. It's just asking you to find factual differences between Andrew and Edgar on question 2. It could also be, I'll come to you in a minute, it could also be similarities. Be aware in the past, on one occasion, it has been similarities. So instead of write a summary of the differences, it says write a summary of the similarities. Leela, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, in this case, when they ask a question like this, you can say some of the differences is the man is an actor, and then I've forgotten the name. That's why I'm using the man as an example. And then the woman is a queen, and then
so if you wanted to go back to that picture, So Mary the First of England obviously was a queen of England with great power, and Dennis Waterman was an actor on the television. Now that would be a fairly straightforward difference between the 2 of them. Absolutely. One of them lived in the 20th and the 21st centuries, and the other one lived in the 16th century. You know, so 16th century. So you know, one of them, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it is literally that. It is, you know, straightforward differences between the 2. In this case, people, but it's not always people. Now there was a question that came up on the paper a couple of years ago, which was basically it was about, one of them was a group of people who went to Hawaii in the 1700s, and they saw the natives using surfboards because they invented surfboards and they were having a great fun surfing. Now these surfboards that they'd made were really quite rough. They were chopped out of the trees with rough tools and so on, and then sanded down and so on. But the other piece of writing was about a surfing community in California in the 1960s, where people were paying $100, $200 for a surfboard. It was made in a specialist factory. And it said, write a summary of the similarities between the surfboards in source A and source B. So they were looking for the similarities between the surfboards. And you could actually see people in the exam hall going, really? Because they were expecting it to be differences. And that's the ones who even noticed. There were lots of people who didn't notice, and they wrote about differences anyway, even though it said similarities. So right from the word go, when you see the question, make sure what it says, whether it says differences or similarities, because it will change. It will change what you're looking for very much. Yeah. It's usually been differences. Differences is easier, but on at least one occasion it has been similarities. So please watch out for that. So in this case, it's just factual differences between two people. Now, question 4, as we know, is compare how the writers convey their different attitudes to education. Compare how the writers convey their different attitudes to education. Now, that is different because in this one, Andrew and Edgar are the people that the writers are talking about. This is a guy who does study guides, and the writer is interviewing him. This is a 19th century headmaster who's written a letter. They both have very different views of education, but Andrew Brough is not the writer. He is not the author of the article. So when it comes to this one, you're looking at the person who's doing the interview's attitude to education, not that guy who is in the first question. So there can be quite a big difference between the people in the text and the writers of the text, and you must make sure that question 4 is always about the writers of the text. So the only thing that question 2 and 4 have in common is that they are both about differences or similarities, and you are comparing. That's it. On question 2, you really want a summary of 3 differences or similarities about one aspect of the 2 texts. So again, it's 3 paragraphs, and you basically say, you know, go back to the fairs at Glastonbury Festival. You can get married in the marriage booth. You can listen to top pop acts, and you can I don't know, something else. Whereas in Dickens's 19th century fair, the food is sort of very rich and very countrified, traditional food. There are lots of different bands all playing at once, and so on, and there are games to play. Those 3 different things give you your 3 paragraphs. And the one aspect was things to see and do at the fair or the festival. But question 4 was always going to be 3 paragraphs about the different points of view of the writers and the methods they use to show those points of view. So it's 3 differences or similarities about one aspect of the 2 texts versus 3 paragraphs about perspectives and methods of the writer. Lucinda.
Please, so in question 3, that one, are we going to give the answers on both texts?
Question 3, the language question, no. On question 1 and question 3, you're only asked about one of the texts.
So you can choose to answer any one?
No, you can't choose. You're told which one.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, usually, if they're being really, really nice to you, they will say question 1 will be about source A and question 3 will be about source B, which means you can actually read source A and then do question 1, then read source B and do question 3, and then do question 2 and question 4. And you've read both of them and you can do the comparing. But sometimes they'll do question 1 and 3 on the same text. It's just kind of random, but make sure you know which text those questions are about. You have to look for it. It'll be right there in big letters at the top, but even so, I like to underline or put circles around things like that. Okay. Let's just go through these comparisons of what's in the two, and then we'll have a look at the questions. So that's one fact about the differences between the two. Question 2 talks about factual differences between the text. So you are actually just picking out things which are facts. Now, they may be implied facts, you know, they may be quite subtle differences. And in fact, the more subtle the difference is, the higher the marks you get on that question. But they are still facts. Whereas on question 4, you are talking about the writer's perspectives, the writer's points of view. You never mention the writers on question 2. Question 4 is all about the writers. Question 2, the best answers will focus on inferred differences. That is, the slightly less obvious ones. So, you know, if we're talking about the differences between the surfboards, well, the fact that one is 3'6" and the other one is only 2'6", well, that's okay, but it's one's shorter than the other. Well, that's it. That's not much to say there, is there? Whereas if you talk about the fact that one is a you know, like a consumer item that's bought from top stores for lots of money, the other is very personal and has great sort of symbolic meaning for the owner. Those aren't quite so obvious differences, but they're still factual differences. So you're talking about factual differences, but as interesting as you can make them, whereas on question 4, as well as the perspectives, you're talking about methods. Quotes are used on question 2 to give evidence of your factual points. So if you find a factual point about the surfboard, you simply quote it. So you say, in Hawaii, the surfboards were longer. And then you'll quote about 3'6", close quote, right? Whereas in question 4, the quotes you give will be an example of the method being used. So if you say that they use onomatopoeia, your quote will be, you know, in quotes, bang, or something like that. So the summary of factual differences or similarities is only worth 8 marks. That's question 2. They only want you to spend about 10 minutes on it. And really, it's only going to be about one particular aspect of the text. It's like question 1. Question 1 is a purely factual piece of writing. Sorry, a factual question. This one asks you to identify explicit or implicit meanings. That is, the obvious and the not so obvious meanings in the text. Higher marks are given for people who go for the less obvious answers. I'm not going to talk about that. So question 2 is about deciding whether it's between differences or similarities. What about the text is it asking you? And identifying 3 differences or similarities between factual components, making the comparisons as subtle as you can, and stating those differences and similarities in double P paragraphs. So this explained the double P a bit more, sorry. So you make a point, you explain your point, and you evidence with a quote. And so a double P paragraph is you make a point about A, explain that point, evidence with a quote, then say, in contrast, on the other hand, however, or if it's a similarity, you know, and also in source B, make a point about source B, explain that point, evidence that quote, and do it 3 times. So this is repeating what we've talked about so far. Yeah, that's it. So I want to just go back and have a look at the question paper. Nope, that's not it. Sorry. Here we go. So right, so on this particular paper, we had, so your paper 1, which is the choose 4 statements below which are true. Yeah. Everybody happy with this question? You should be. It's one of the easiest questions. Yeah. The only thing here is when you're actually doing the exam, make sure you only put 4, because if you put 5, they will only mark they will go from the top and they will mark the first 4 they see. So if you have changed your mind about one, make sure you've completely obliterated it in the way shown. I think you have to put a cross right through the box, because if there are 5, they won't answer the 5th one. They won't mark the 5th one, even if it's right. So be careful about that. Right, so here's your question 2. The effects of the weather on people in both sources are very different. Use details from both sources to write a summary of the different ways people are affected by the weather. So in this case, it's the different ways people are affected by the weather. So you have to find 3 good differences of the ways that the people are affected in source A and source B for your 8 marks. And here it does inform you that it's the whole of source A and the whole of source B. In question 3, they give you the line numbers that you're looking at. So you shouldn't really go outside of those line numbers. Quite often they'll actually print the piece of writing that you're looking at, lines 13 to 23. They'll just print it on your exam paper. It makes it even easier. How does the writer use language to describe the storm in this case? So you're only looking at those 10 lines. So stick to those 10 lines.
Ramin, for this question answer 3, do
Yes.
we need to explain the language technique or just mention the language technique and describe the situation?
Okay, now this is the language question. All right, so the question that says how does the writer use language is the language question, and it's about the use of language. Therefore, this is the question where you must explain the use of language. You must explain what the words mean. So you're going to choose a quote which describes the storm. Okay, so you find a couple of words or 3 or 4 words that describes the storm, and you put that as a quote, and you explain what that quote means. And you then explain how it means that. That is, you explain the way the words actually make that meaning. And then finally, you will talk about how that would affect the writer.
So we have to use PEE rule, right?
You can use, yes, because you are, well, you actually have to make 3 separate points in that one. If you pardon me, I'll just see if I can find something, make that absolutely clear. I mean, we did, you weren't with us last week. Oh, we looked at structure, didn't we, last time? Oh, right. So sorry about that. So just very briefly, my magic bullet on language analysis. Can you all see that? Or can you see the magic bullet?
No.
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 Okay. No. Beg your pudding. Right. So this is now looking at question 3 on paper 2 or question 2 on paper 1. that it's on both. So I like to get it down to as simple as you possibly can make it. And basically, for the language question, you find a quote that answers the question. So in this case, we were looking for language which describes the storm. So you find a quote, you explain what it means, what that quote means in your own words, and then you explain why does it mean that. That's the really difficult bit. That's the bit that gets the marks. Why does it mean what you've said? Why does it mean that? How does it mean that? And then finally, how does that affect the reader? What effect does that have on the reader? The why does it mean that is the difficult bit. We'll come to that. So to find the quote, I would say it needs to be an interesting quote. I say it should be juicy. That means you can squeeze a lot out of it. So not a simple and boring piece of writing. You need to find interesting little quote. It might have a language feature in it. It doesn't have to. It could just be words. Doesn't have to have a special thing, but if it does, you'll be able to mention that. So if you choose a simile, for example, you'll be able to explain the simile, how it works. And you might want to do that. Do you personally understand it? Don't choose a piece of writing as a quote if you don't understand what it means. If you don't understand it, leave it alone. There'll be other quotes that you do understand. I've seen people try and explain things they don't understand. It's pointless. Just don't do that. You know, choose another one. Keep it very brief. By brief, I mean 3 or 4 words maximum. Don't have massive long quotes. For the language question particularly, you need to stick to 3 or 4 words. Sometimes even 1 word will do. You know, if you're talking about onomatopoeia, you can just have the word whisper, 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 and explain the effect and what it means and how it works. But always use quote marks. Put quote marks around anything, any words that come from the text. Do it the first time you quote. Do it every time you quote. So if you quote a line and then you want to talk about 1 word from that line, when you take the 1 word out to talk about it, put that 1 word in quotes as well. Because you're not writing the word, you're talking about the word. The word isn't being used to mean anything. It's just an object that you're pointing at. It could just be a picture or anything. The word itself has now become an object. So keep it inside quote marks. And make sure it answers the question. So if you've been asked to find a piece of language that talks about the weather, do that. Don't choose a piece of language which talks about the boy, or talks about the sunshine, or talks about the tree. You know, it seems again a silly thing to say, but people do sometimes just want to say, oh, I like that bit of language, I'll talk about it. But it doesn't actually answer the question. Choose, you know, make sure you know what the question's asking about. Don't presume, actually recognize that I'm looking for those particular references, not another. So I'll just run through my example. So if the question was, how does the writer use language to describe the fighting? I might want to talk about this soldier. And I've chosen the quote, soldier roared into battle. Soldier roared into battle. So roared is obviously the interesting word here. So my first thing that I do on my magic bullet is, what does it mean? Well, I'm saying that it means that the soldier went into battle like a wild animal or like a lion. And that means he was brave and fierce and scary, like wild animals and lions. I'm saying that saying he roared into battle means this. That's my point that I am making. Now, why and how am I making that point? Because the word roared is a sound associated with wild animals, especially big cats like lions and tigers. Animals roar when they are angry or attacking. Going into battle is to attack an enemy and take part in war. So the soldier going into action is being compared to a lion attacking. Okay, so it seems like that a lot of that's very obvious, but that shows the examiner that I understand exactly what the writer was doing with that particular word choice there. That is because the word roared associates in my mind with lions. Therefore, I get the image of him being like a lion when he goes into battle, and that's telling me that he's fierce and savage and so on. There's a million different ways of doing it, but that's one. And then finally, what is the effect on the reader? Well, people aren't usually said to be like wild animals, so this will make the reader feel how savage and fierce the soldier is. You'll make them understand that. It may even be a criticism of the soldier, that he has become inhuman. Maybe war makes a soldier inhuman in some way. It would depend on the context, you know. So that's quite a simple way of doing it, and you can make it more complex. Obviously, the word roared is a sound, but you could instead say is onomatopoeia. So as well as you know, you could even say it's changing the soldier in my mind into an animal, so that becomes zootropism. You know, there's lots of, you know, the fancy technical terms that you could throw in there if you want to. But actually, just straightforwardly describing it is perfectly effective. So do you see what we did there? So if you then go for 2 more quotes and do the same again, that's basically the language question.
Right.
So yeah.
Please, can I see the first one on the screen? What do you call it? Just a moment, please. The magic bullets, the first one. Can you please put this on the screen for me, please?
Is it not there now?
No, the one which explains what does it mean.
Okay, yeah. So there's my quote, and then what does it mean? Now this is me putting it into my own words.
Yes.
What I think that quote means.
Okay, yes. Oh,
yeah. Now remember, there's no right or wrong answer there. It's your opinion. So if you simply choose a piece of a quote, and then you say what you think it means, as long as you can explain why you think that. The examiners are looking for you to attempt to take language apart and to suggest how the writer's mind worked in putting it together. None of us can actually know that the writer intended to do that. It's simply, you know, the word roared connects in my mind with animals and tigers. And so I think it's some kind of a metaphor in which he's being turned into an animal. But somebody else might take it another way and talk about the onomatopoeia. Yeah. So here the writer is using onomatopoeia to give us a feeling of being in the battle, hearing the soldier running into, you know, and screaming at the top of his voice. It makes us feel more involved in the battle. That would be another way of doing the same thing. And the fact is, the writer might be using the word roared to do both of those things at the same time. Any other questions about question 3? Now, you're looking at question. Yes, all right. You're looking at question 3. You're doing question. Yes, you're doing paper 2 next, aren't you? You're in your big mocks, and you'll notice that paper 2, question 3. That's the language question on paper 2, is worth 12 marks, whereas on paper 1 it's worth 8 marks. Now, what's the difference? Now, the difference is that this exam, I mean, the history of it is that we used to have two different papers, and one was foundation and one was higher. And the higher papers were designed for people who wanted to get the highest, most grades. And the foundation papers were for people who wanted to achieve the C pass mark. And so the foundation paper was easier. But now we only do one paper. So they still have to make sure that there are questions in there that give higher level candidates, which is what they call them, the opportunity to get extra marks. So what they've done is they've taken the 8-mark language question, and it is exactly the same question as it is on paper 1, and they've given an extra 4 marks for depth. So what they want to see from those people wanting to get level 9, level 8, level 7, they want to see them going deeper into their analysis of the meanings of the pieces of writing, the meanings of the language. And they would describe it a bit like this. You can see that these the little girl and the lady are standing in the same swimming pool, but one of them is going deeper. So it's simply, it's the same water, but there's more depth allowed on paper 2. And so if you give an extra sentence or so of analysis, you can pick up more than 8 marks. You can go all the way to 12 marks. So it's really about how comfortable you feel about explaining how you think the writer has used language to create the effect, and maybe feeling a little bit more about the effect that it has on the reader. Perhaps talking about, how it motivates the reader, how it would make them feel, how it makes them sympathize with what's going on in the story, and so on. It's if you can say a bit more about the individual effects of that piece of language on you or on a reader that you can imagine. And here's another way of making it a bit deeper. Quite often on paper 2, question 3, the piece of writing that you get is the 19th century one. They'll do question 3 on the 19th century literary nonfiction. And they do that because they want you to really sort of struggle with the language. Obviously, if you can get your head around the 19th century language, you're doing a harder job than if it was 21st or 20th century. So if you've got that and you want to go more in depth into it and all, then you can actually get yourself a fair few marks simply by talking about the effect on the original reader. Because there is a difference between somebody reading now in the 21st century, that's yourself, reading that on the 12th of June on a Monday morning. The effect it has on you may be very different to the effect it had on somebody 150 or 200 years ago. And if you can imagine or even speculate what the effect of that language would have been on a reader reading it then, and say, I think a reader in the 19th century would have felt this or thought that's even more impressive. Okay, so think about how it might have affected the original reader, as well as how it affects you now. Might be a big difference between the two, and that might be something that would get you extra marks on that paper 2 question 3. Okay, so I think I'm coming to the end of this, but I'm quite happy to answer any questions you might have about particularly about paper 2, but anything really on GCSE. But I'm going to stop the recording now.